Hello and welcome back to the Biochemistry for Health Sciences channel. We'll continue in this video discussing metabolism, and we'll talk about the most important metabolic highway. Remember, the objective of these series of videos on metabolism is not simply to memorize metabolic pathways, but to understand the basic design of metabolism in a human being and how we can apply this knowledge as a healthcare professional or healthcare student. So in a previous video, we established this very important fact or limitation, and that is our blood glucose concentration must always be above 40 to 50 milligrams per deciliter, so that the blood has enough glucose in order to feed your 24 trillion red blood cells as well as your brain cells. So this is a very, very important statement, a very important fact that we have to always keep at the back of our minds when we talk about metabolism. So why is this necessary requirement for our body? That's because, number one, as we mentioned in a previous video, our cells do not store energy, they do not store ATP, which means they have to make ATP at all times, because cells require energy all the time, irrespective whether you're awake, asleep, exercising, or whatever. The second important limitation that we have here is that our brain cells, as well as those 24 trillion red blood cells, the only fuel they can use to generate energy is glucose. So remember, to generate energy, we need fuel and oxygen. And there are a variety of fuels that other cells can use, but as far as the brain cells and the red blood cells, only glucose. So that's a huge limitation. So this means that irrespective of what the other cells want, the most important thing the body has to always keep in mind, always provide, and that is it has to always maintain the blood glucose to a sufficient amount, more than 40-50 milligrams per deciliter, so that this glucose is always available to our red blood cells as well as to the brain cells. So with this background that we discussed in a previous video, probably a logical place to start learning about metabolism is this, and that is, how do we get energy from this very important molecule called glucose? So this is the focus of this video. How is glucose converted into ATP? So there are hundreds of reactions that happen in cells, in a typical cell. And here is a simple version of a metabolic map showing the various pathways, metabolic pathways that happen in a cell. So let's trace the glucose to ATP pathway. So here we have glucose, and glucose is going through metabolism, and we'll talk about these various metabolic pathways. Is going through metabolism, and then we get a lot of hydrogens in the form of NADH and FADH2, and then it continues going through metabolism and eventually forming ATP. Okay, so this is the pathway by which glucose is being converted into ATP. So this glucose to ATP pathway is made up of 4 parts. So the first is called glycolysis, also known as the Embden-Meyerhof pathway. And there we see here glucose getting converted to pyruvate. This pathway is called glycolysis. So this is your glycolysis pathway, also called the Embden-Meyerhof pathway. The second is called the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, or PDH. So here you can see the pyruvate is entering the mitochondria, and there the pyruvate is being converted to acetyl-CoA by this complex enzyme system called PDH. So this is our second part. So this is the first part, this is our second part. The third part is the TCA cycle, or the Krebs cycle. Krebs cycles, also called the citric acid cycle, also called TCA, which stands for tricarboxylic acid cycle. Tricarboxylic acid because citric acid has 3 carboxyl groups. So many different names, and that's right here, the TCA or the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. So the Krebs cycle is the third part, and the fourth part is called the electron transport chain, and this slash here stands for coupled to. So electron transport chain coupled to oxidative phosphorylation, and we just write this as ETCOP. Okay, so we'll just abbreviate this as ETCOP, electron transport chain coupled to oxidative phosphorylation, and that is right here. This is your electron transport chain, and this is the oxidative phosphorylation part. So this whole thing would be our ETC coupled to oxidative phosphorylation. So instead of saying glucose to ATP pathway or keep on repeating glycolysis, PDH, TCA, ETCOP, let's just call all of this combination from glucose to ATP, let's just call this the main street. Okay, so the metabolic map is just like a map of streets in a city. So let's just call this main streets. From now on, when I say main street, I mean glycolysis, PDH, the TCA, and then the ETCOP. Now, before we proceed further with this video or future videos in metabolism, there's one very important point I want you to keep in mind, a very important concept. And that is in order to generate maximum amounts of ATP, if the cell wants to make as much ATP as possible, it requires a mitochondria, because all these reactions are happening in the mitochondria. And what it's doing is actually taking hydrogens from the food that you're eating, so in this case, hydrogens from glucose, and it's sending the hydrogens into the electron transport chain. So all these hydrogens that are coming from your food and other sources, they are being transported into the electron transport chain, and these hydrogens are carried by 2 chemicals. There are only 2 chemicals that can transport these hydrogens into the electron transport chain. One is NADH, and the other is FADH2. Okay, so these are the hydrogens that are being transported, and these hydrogens react with oxygen. Okay, and when hydrogen reacts with oxygen, out comes a lot of energy, because we call these redox reactions very, very rich in energy production. So redox reactions can give a lot of energy, just like batteries. And this energy is then used to make ATP from ADP and PI. Okay, so now when one NADH enters the electron transport chain, keep this number in mind, you will get 2.5 ATPs. When one FADH2 enters the electron transport chain, the cell can make about 1.5 ATP. Okay, so 2.5 from one NADH, 1.5 from 1 FADH2. Now the previous numbers for this were 3 and 2. So some of your textbooks and some articles might still use 3 and 2. But the newer numbers that we use now are 2.5 and 1.5. So this is an important concept to remember. It doesn't matter where the NADH or the FADH2 is coming from, whether it's coming from glucose or whether it's coming from fatty acids or whether it's coming from amino acids, it just doesn't matter. So as long as the NADH is in the mitochondria, it can transport its hydrogens to electron transport chain, and same thing with the FADH2, and one NADH will give you 2.5 ATP, one FADH2 will give us 1.5 ATP. So these numbers here will become very useful later on as we calculate how much energy can we get from glucose or fatty acids or whatever. Okay, so to calculate how much energy in the form of kilocalories or kilojoules or whatever unit we are interested in, we need to remember these numbers. One NADH 2.5 ATPs, one FADH2 1.5 ATPs. Okay, so let's calculate how many ATPs or how much energy will you get from one glucose. Okay, so first let's look at a cell that has a mitochondria. Okay, cells that have mitochondria, which means all cells except red blood cells. Red blood cells don't have mitochondria, so this is not going to be applicable to red blood cells. But rest of cells is good. So they must have a mitochondria and they must have oxygen. Okay, so they must have this oxygen. If the cell does have a mitochondria and oxygen, such as a muscle cell or neuron, okay, or hepatocyte, a liver cell, then this is how much ATP the cell can get from one glucose. Okay, so we start with glucose right here, and it goes through glycolysis. Now, in the first reaction of glycolysis, we can see instead of making ATP, the cell is using up ATP, so that's -1. And then the same thing happens in the third reaction. ATP is used up, so that's another -1. And then in reaction 4 here, this molecule is broken into this and this. Okay, if you look at it in reaction 4, this fructose 1,6-bisphosphate is broken to DHAP and glycerol 3-phosphate. And then the next reaction, this is converted into this. So this means at the end of reaction 4 and 5, what we get is two molecules of glycerol 3-phosphate from one glucose. Okay, so here onwards, you can see we have to multiply everything by 2 because one glucose is giving us 2 glycerol 3-phosphate. Okay, so in reaction 7, now the cell is making ATP. So here is ATP. So this is really 2 ATPs plus 2 ATPs. And then again in reaction 10, the cell is making ATP. Once again, 2 ATPs. Why 2? Because there are 2 glycerol 3-phosphate. So this means in glycolysis, we used up -1, so we used up -2, but we made +2 and +2, we made +4. So the net ATP production is +2 per glucose. Okay, so in glycolysis, the net production of ATP is 2 because we consume 2, but we produce 4 from glucose. Okay, so that's for glycolysis. Now let's look at the next step, the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. So we get 2 pyruvates. Remember, everything is multiplied by 2. And these 2 pyruvates now enter the mitochondria. So now we are talking about everything that's happening in the mitochondria. This is your cytoplasm. Glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm. But now we are going into the mitochondria. So in this PDH reaction, you can see 2 pyruvates are being converted to 2-acetyl-CoA. Okay, we don't show this 2 here. Most textbooks and most diagrams don't show that, but if you are calculating from 1 glucose, then always keep in mind we are producing 2 pyruvates that will give you 2-acetyl-CoA and so on. Okay, so when the pyruvate is converted to acetyl-CoA, this NAD is converted to NADH. So we are going to get 2 NADH in the mitochondria, and these 2 NADH are going to enter the electron transport chain. And remember, each NADH gives you 2.5 ATPs. So 2 times 2.5, this will give you 5 ATPs here. Okay, so we will get 5 ATPs from the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex. Okay, so we are done with glycolysis, we are done with pyruvate dehydrogenase. Now let's look at what happens in the Krebs cycle. So this acetyl-CoA will now enter the Krebs cycle. And in the Krebs cycle, you can see there are 3 reactions. One that produce NADH, there's another one that produces NADH, and here's another one that produces NADH. So there are 3 NADH from each acetyl-CoA, 1 acetyl-CoA. So from 2 acetyl-CoAs, we should get 6 NADH. Okay, so we are going to get 6 NADH from the 2 acetyl-CoA. So 6 times each NADH is going to give 2.5. That will give you 15 ATPs. So that's how we get this 15 ATPs. Because all of these NADHs are going to enter the electron transport chain. All of these NADHs are going to enter the electron transport chain. And each NADH that enters the electron transport chain, we are using this figure, 2.5 ATP. So 6 times 2.5 will give you 15 ATP. So besides NADH, there is one reaction here, one reaction that in the Krebs cycle that produces FADH2. So remember, 1 acetyl will give you 1 FADH2, 2 acetyl-CoAs will give you 2 FADH2. So we're going to get 2 FADH2, and these 2 FADH2 will enter the electron transport chain. Each FADH2 gives you 1.5 ATPs, so 2 of them will give you 3 ATPs. So that's how we get these 3 ATPs from the FADH2 produced in the Krebs cycle. So besides NADH and FADH2, the Krebs cycle gives you another ATP equivalent, and this is GTP. In terms of energy, GTP is the same as ATP. Okay, so 1 acetyl-CoA gives you 1 GTP, therefore 2 acetyl-CoAs gives you 2 GTPs. So 2 GTPs in terms of energy is equal to 2 ATPs. So from the Krebs cycle, we can add all these ATPs, 15 plus 3 plus 2, and we get a total of 20 ATPs. Now there's another source of ATP, and that's the NADH that is formed in the cytoplasm in glycolysis. Now, if this NADH enters the mitochondria, it must enter the mitochondria in order to transport these hydrogens to electron transport chain. So it must enter the mitochondria. The question is, how does the cytoplasmic NADH enter the mitochondria? So the cytoplasmic NADH enters the mitochondria by a shuttle. If the cell uses a MAS shuttle, then the NADH in the cytoplasm remains as NADH in the mitochondria, and this means you get 2 times 2.5. Each NADH gives you 2.5 ATPs. So 2 NADH, remember this is 2 NADH because we are getting 2 glycerylate triphosphate here. Everything after here is multiplied by 2. So this will give us 5 ATPs if the cell use the MAS. If the cell use the GPS, then the cytoplasmic NADH becomes mitochondrial FADH2. Now the FADH2, 2 of this will only give you 2 times 1.5, which is 3 ATPs. So you get only 3 ATPs if the cell use the GPS shuttle. So depending on which shuttle the cell uses, if the cell use the MAS shuttle, then we will get 2 ATPs from glycolysis here, 5 ATPs from pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, 20 ATPs from the Krebs cycle, and 5 ATPs from the NADH produced in the cytoplasm. That will give you 32 ATPs. If the cell use the GPS shuttle, then instead of 5 here, you get only 3 here, so you have 2 less. That will give you only 30 ATPs. Okay, so depending on which shuttle the cell uses, one glucose can give you either 32 ATPs or 30 ATPs. Okay, so what if the cell did not have or does not have a mitochondria? Example, your 24 trillion red blood cells, they do not have mitochondria. Okay, or what about if the cells did have mitochondria but they don't have oxygen? So for example, if the blood supply to this cell was blocked, there is no more blood coming into the cell, and remember, blood carries oxygen. The red blood cells in the blood carries oxygen, so red blood cells are not entering and not supplying the oxygen to the cell, and that can happen in diseases such as myocardial infarctions or heart attacks, as well as other cardiovascular diseases like stroke. And also in cells that, for example, actively contracting muscle cells, they're using oxygen up so quickly that some cells may not have enough oxygen. So if the cells do not have oxygen or mitochondria, then basically we are eliminating this part on the right-hand side. So now the only place the cell is going to get its energy from is on the left-hand side, and that is glycolysis. And we calculated for this side, for the glycolysis, 1 glucose will give you 2 ATPs. Now you should remember in these situations, for example in red blood cells or cells in the heart that is undergoing a heart attack or stroke in the brain, this pyruvate that is made from glycolysis must be converted to lactate so that this NADH can be reconverted back to NAD. Okay, so NADH here can be reconverted to NAD, and this NAD can be reused in reaction 6 as we talked about in a previous video. So in this case, you can see lactic acid being produced. Okay, so red blood cells produce lactic acid all the time, and in diseases such as heart attacks and strokes, or any cell that's undergoing, or even in exercising muscle cell, any cell that has mitochondria that doesn't have enough oxygen and is relying on glycolysis for its ATP, they are all producing lactic acid or lactate. So this glucose to ATP highway, this glucose to ATP route, this main street, is probably the most important metabolic street in your cell, in your body. It not only provides energy, it not only gives you the ATPs necessary for cell survival. A lot of these intermediates of glycolysis or PDAs or the Krebs cycle, they can be used as building blocks for synthesis of other molecules such as lipids and so on. And this pathway also connects many other pathways. So for example, as we shall see later on when we break down fatty acids, we get acetyl-CoA. You get acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA can be used to make ketone bodies. Acetyl-CoA can be used to make fatty acids, okay, and so on. So many pathways connect main street. So to summarize, the glucose to ATP is one of the most important metabolic highway. So this main street is one of the most important metabolic pathways that we find in cells. Okay, so we'll have more on main street in the next video. Thank you very much for watching. Goodbye for now and have a very happy day. We will see you soon.